We're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for being here tonight. My name is Betty Cruz. I'm with the World Affairs Council of Pittsburgh, and we're here today to have a roundtable conversation with each of you and with our featured speakers and partners. I do want to share the event tonight is being recorded and it is being live streamed, so we are engaging also audiences outside of this room, but very much looking forward to being in conversation with each of you, and then perhaps anyone who's joining us live might submit some questions as we move through the conversation. The World Affairs Council is about bringing people together around global issues. We do that in high schools with students, as well as in the community through programs like today's. This program tonight, the title is How Authoritarian Governments Are Influencing Pennsylvania Elections. And it's hosted as a two-part series. We were in Pittsburgh last night in the South Side at City Theater, getting into mis and disinformation, which we'll talk about tonight as well, because it's relevant, of course. And here we wanted to do a deeper dive on this particular topic as it relates to Pennsylvania elections and authoritarian governments. Now, to do that, I'm very honored to have Rachael, Dean Wilson, and David Salvo with us. They're both from the Alliance for Securing Democracy. We are partnered in putting this program together alongside Pitt Cyber. And the format for tonight is we're gonna kick off with each of them kind of grounding us in their background, the work that they do every day, orienting us a bit on mis and disinformation and the topic, and then we're gonna open it up for a dialogue. So we have about 90 minutes together. Now, with that, let me introduce them. So David Salvo is the Deputy Director of the Alliance for Securing Democracy and the Senior Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. David is the principal author of the ASD Policy Blueprint for Countering Authoritarian Interference in Democracies and an expert on Russian affairs, particularly Russian foreign policy. He has appeared on media including NPR, CNN, Fox Business, MSNBC, and ABC News to discuss the tactics and objectives of Russia's operations to undermine democracy in the United States and Europe. Rachael Dean Wilson is the head of external affairs at the Alliance for Securing Democracy, where she leads 2022 midterm election strategy, communications and messaging, policymaker outreach, and domestic programming. So I paused.
Sorry, I wanted you all to know, what I do on a daily basis.
Driven by her belief that safeguarding democracy must involve all Americans, Rachael has spoken in cities across the country about the importance of building democratic resilience to autocratic efforts to undermine democracy. She's appeared in news outlets ranging from the Washington Post and C-SPAN to WVTM Birmingham on election security issues and written on China's state-backed messaging. Welcome, David and Rachael. Again, thank you both for being here with us. Now let's start by getting to know each of you a little bit more, the work that you're doing and why this topic is important to you. Rachael.
Yeah, so it's really great to be here. Thank you all for coming. I'm excited to get to discuss this. I think this is like such a small group that we can actually have a conversation, which I'm very excited about. And I'll tell you a little bit more about ASD first and what we do, and then kind of how I found my way to this topic. So the Alliance for Securing Democracy, we kind of started out looking at Russia, China, and Iran, and how it really started after Russian interference in the 2016 election, which was a incredibly sophisticated campaign and effort to interfere in our democracy, which I kind of take personally. And so we look at what are the tools and tactics that these actors employ and how do they target Americans and how do they seek to undermine our trust in democracy? Because at the end of the day, it's not totally about flipping an election one way or the other that's like better for them. It's about undermining our faith in our democracy and our elections and our system and really in each other. And so that is distressing to me, and I'm sure it's distressing to you as well. But part of what we do is identify what their strategies are and try to help explain them as a way of building resilience to them. So we'll get into that a little bit more later. Me personally, I have spent most of my career in politics, on campaigns and in government, working for Senator John McCain. And so he really instilled in me this idea that American democracy is a force for good here in the United States and around the world. And so I kind of feel like this work that we do is a bit of a continuation of the work that he did, a small part, but I like to think that. So, so that's kind of, I bring that political background and perspective, and I'll flip it over to Dave. I think he's a good complement. He brings the real knowledge over there. So.
Great to see you all. Thanks for coming out. I'm David Salvo. I'm from a small town on the other side of Pennsylvania, so it's great to be in person. So really looking forward to today's conversation. As was stated, my expertise is mostly in studying Russia and tools and tactics of Russian authoritarianism, both at home and abroad. I spent 10 years in the State Department, pretty much all those years focused on Russia, Russian affairs, Russian interference in the country's periphery. I lived and worked and studied in Russia for several years. So it's a place I know really well. And like Rachael, maybe for different reasons, or probably the same reasons, I was disturbed by the Russian campaign here in 2016. And it wasn't so much about who they may or may not have wanted to win the election. For me personally, it wasn't about that. It was really because I actually didn't think that was ultimately the Russian overarching objective. It was, as Rachael had said, to really shake our confidence in our own system, which I think has happened. I think the fact that here we are 6 years later talking about these issues at each other's throats over questions of election integrity, for example, without a Russian thumb on the scale, really this time, goes to show you the extent to which they succeeded in their operation. And that bothers me just as an average American. It also bothers me as a former US government official who was himself sort of a target of Russian state power when I lived on their turf. So I think for both Rachael and I, we joined the Alliance for Securing Democracy, to try to engage Americans in more of like a bipartisan, cross-political spectrum effort to get on the same page about why democracy is important, regardless of who wins an election, why we want to have confidence in our system, and what bad actors out there, foreign and increasingly domestic, are doing to try to shake our faith in that system. So I assume we're going to dive right into those topics. So I'll shut up and start the conversation.
We will. And before we get into the influence of Russia, China, Iran, let's actually dig into some of the grounding language and understanding. When we say mis and disinformation, what are we talking about? What does that actually mean? Rachael.
Yeah, it's so important because I feel like disinformation is kind of thrown around just to mean whatever the person saying it wants it to mean, even if it's just, I don't agree with this, so it must be disinformation. So it's important because one of the main tools are information operations. And a huge part of that is disinformation and misinformation. So when we're talking about disinformation, that is something that is false information that is spread with malign intent, the intent to deceive. And then misinformation is still false information, but the intent isn't there. And that's important because something can start out as disinformation, and then by the time I've texted it to my mom, who texted it to her sister or something, it's not. There's no intent there. We just have untruths roaming. So that's really the difference between the two, and I think important for us when we're talking about and identifying this and misinformation. Like step number one is having a shared vocabulary to talk about like what we're seeing online and all the different types of information that's coming at us.
Great. Now, to get into this point around, again, Russia, China, Iran, and what is their interest? What is their interest in our elections, both across the US and then also Pennsylvania specifically?
Sure. So, I always start these conversations by talking about 2016, not because anyone gets any joy sort of rehashing a contentious period in our history, but because it really is indicative of the overall strategic objectives of why foreign governments might actually try to swing an election one way or the other. I'll also preface my remarks by saying I don't think that Donald Trump's election in 2016 was a direct cause of Russian interference. And I say that because some people think we might have a bias or something like that. And it's not about that, but it's because when Russia started its campaign to influence the American election, they never thought that Donald Trump would win, just like many Americans at the beginning did not think Donald Trump would win. But two, because it wasn't their overarching strategic objective. I'm sure they were happy about it, but they wanted us to tear each other apart. And it's no different with just as sort of insidious, but maybe less capable governments like Iran. They too want us to be sort of distracted domestically. And that's the point. Governments like Russia want a weakened America that's divided, that is sort of at each other's throats, that is on the brink of, I don't think we're on the brink of civil war or anything like that, but that is like leading essentially in a direction that prevents the United States from being the major player on the global stage. Right now there's war going on in Ukraine. Russia re-invaded Ukraine a few months ago. We have been sending billions of dollars of security assistance to the Ukrainian military. Well, if we have another contentious election period this go around, are we even going to be focused on the war in Ukraine? So there are geopolitical dimensions to this that would cause a country like Russia or China that's competing with us for influence on the global stage to try to put their thumbs on the scales and try to inflame or amplify existing divisions between us. They didn't create the divisions between Americans; those were existing already. But they did an excellent job of targeting us to inflame those divisions. And in particular, Russia in 2016 really micro-targeted segments of the American electorate. So, the average Pennsylvanian may not have thought that they were sort of in crosshairs of a Russian state-sponsored influence campaign in 2016, but they were. They were buying the Russian state-sponsored actors, their troll factory in St. Petersburg, were buying ads on Facebook targeting Americans in specific states, key swing states like Pennsylvania, and on both sides of the political spectrum. So they were buying ads that on issues like gun control and abortion, really sensitive social and political issues that they knew would inflame passions. And they were organizing rallies on behalf of Donald Trump. So think about that. Russian intelligence officers were actually on Facebook organizing Americans to get out in the street and rally for Donald Trump. But they were also buying ads in support of Hillary Clinton and pandering to Democrats on that side. So they were weighing in across the American landscape, trying to inflame emotions, inflame passions, get Americans out on the street, possibly incite violence. I know this sounds melodramatic, but like this was what they wanted. The Iranians tried some of this in 2020, but they were not very successful. They just don't know how to do this like Russia does. Russia knows us extremely well, extremely well. And that's why they knew exactly which issues to target, which swing states to target, which communities in swing states to target. They knew our electoral process and electorate maybe even better than we know ourselves sometimes. And so, ultimately, what they want is American democracy on the decline, American global leadership on the decline. They would love it if we became an authoritarian country, because it would help justify their own corrupt system of government back home to their own citizens whom they impoverish. And so there are all these dimensions to why they would do this, and it's not so much about electing a particular candidate as it is about just getting us to hate each other, help destroy our democracy.
And if I can
Please.
jump in and just say a couple words on China. What's really interesting there. So the intelligence community determined that while Russia and Iran tried to interfere in the 2020 election, China thought about it and then decided not to. So that's an interesting difference. But what we've had several warnings about from, Mike Pompeo and the Trump administration to just recently is Chinese operatives trying to kind of make headway with local leaders and local communities and state leaders. which is really interesting. So they're asserting influence, not necessarily during elections, but trying to make sure that their priorities, be it, get in somewhere economically speaking, and so they can provide, invest in, there was what was it? It was like a pergola that they were going to build in DC, that looked like a great deal. They were going to make a lot of, the city was going to make a lot of money off of this. And then it was reviewed, and the catch was that all of this really sounds, as I'm saying it out loud, sounds conspiratorial, but it's true. The catch was they were going to bring all the building materials over in diplomatic pouches. And so those could not be inspected. And where the pergola was going to be built was a great range to pick up sensitive information in DC. And so that got scrapped, but it's their influence and what they're trying to achieve is a little, they exert their influence differently, and they have a different way of going about this, but it's still very much want to have that impact, just, a little, they have the economic weight to throw around that I think it's a little different.
Yeah. I think you've both talked to how foreign actors are using the digital space to create division and create distrust. Can you say, Rachel, a bit more on what you see as the biggest disinformation challenge ahead of the midterms?
Yeah, and this is really, if you look at all the tools that they use, I mean, it's easiest to go back to 2016 also because we had the Mueller report, and so it was incredibly detailed of every single part of this operation. But so they use like cyber attacks and spear phishing, a dump and leak campaign around emails, and then these information operations online. And so the information piece, yes, there was straight up disinformation, but also they were pushing kind of at the extremes. If they could get involved in a certain movement group online and just push a little bit farther, and so, but the biggest threat I see for the midterms, and I would say from a foreign actor perspective, it's a little tricky because with a presidential race, like you have a clear goal, like there's a national narrative to latch on to and to work on. Midterms are a little different because there isn't that like one presidential race that you're looking at, but what we are seeing is like disinformation around election administration is probably our biggest weakness going into the midterms, just because with 2020, I think we're primed to look for that. And so, that can quickly escalate and can be very problematic.
So what would you say is the responsibility of major platforms like Twitter, Facebook, etc.?
Yeah, it's really hard to regulate. They're hard to regulate. If it was easy, we would have already done it. And I think there was a little bit of appetite in DC to try and regulate, and that seems to be going away. We've seen some states try to regulate them, like California. But that gets tricky in that you're asking these huge organizations to have different platforms depending on what state they're in. But like, how do you enforce that? It's pretty complicated.
Well, with the state also bringing in the role of whether it's individuals or governments, if you want to speak to that as well.
Yeah. So yes. So we are also seeing a shift from, like, they're making a lot of algorithmic changes that just make this all like private conversations that are going to be even more difficult to track and to kind of keep tabs on. But so as far as what we're to do about this, I think step one is probably on like, there's a lot that the individual can do as far as how you consume information. So the information diet that is a really important thing to look at, just as your normal diet is an important thing to look at. But how much information are you consuming? Where are you getting it? And at what point is that like counterproductive? I think that's something that we all, as we have more information at our fingertips than any time in human history, that's something we need to take seriously. And it's just kind of, it's been a slow creep for me. I don't know if y'all feel the same way, but like where it's like, it just becomes more and more accessible until someday it like, where do I end and my phone gets, and why am I even looking at this? And so I think being really purposeful about how we're engaging with information is important. Looking at the sources of your information, and if you don't know what they are, trying to, make sure that it's something that you want to be consuming. And then finally, I would say that one of the main strategies here is to use emotional responses to kind of make these disinformation campaigns catch on. And so usually the material is incredibly emotional. Now, campaigns use emotional material, advertisers use emotional material to get you to take action. But just to be aware that like if I'm having a super emotional response to something, that is worth checking in why and like where it's coming from. And so that's something we can do as individuals. And if you don't know where, like usually you can figure out why someone's pushing something, right? If it's a campaign, they want their candidate to win, this is the campaign narrative, got it. If it's, a local news outlet, I would hope that that's information sharing and factual and you trust them because it's the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette or whatever else it may be. But if that's shady, we can't figure that out, I would check it. Or,
Great.
Ready?
Yeah.
Back to the question about, what could the platforms do? For example, what could Facebook and Twitter and social media platforms do better? Since I don't think any of us believes that the platform should be regulated free speech, I'm not even going to go there. But what I do think they could do is better amplify official sources of information. So, because the whole notion of election integrity has been sort of hijacked to fit whatever political purposes a particular candidate is striving for. The whole notion that state and local election officials, whose job it is to conduct elections freely and fairly, they've been drowned out by all the voices that have sort of hijacked the whole narrative about the integrity of elections. But they, state and local election officials are Democrats and Republicans, whose nonpartisan job it is to conduct these elections fairly. And they do that in the overwhelming majority of circumstances. And they're the ones that know, here's how you vote, here's when you vote, here's how the votes are counted, here's what we're doing with mail-in ballots. And those voices are drowned out on social media by all the people who are trying to hijack those terms for their own political purposes. I wish the platforms would do a better job of elevating that sort of official discourse into sort of mainstream social media. It's not.
So much to unpack with everything we've already started to talk about. We're going to turn it over to questions. Sure, go for it.
So I'm with the legal and we'd like to share as much information as we can with our members and with the public in general. And so I'm listening and I'm thinking, like there was information when there were financial scams, there was information that said, here's how you identify. Do you have recommendations that we can pass on to the public on how to identify disinformation scams?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I'm happy to send you some information. I can get it after this. One of the things we'll have in dealing with the midterms in particular is kind of, we're hoping to get this out in September, but like a top narrative, like false narratives around the midterms that you'll see and why those are false. And there's a great study done by another research institution, but that looked at kind of all the buckets of disinformation around elections and what are the top 5 narratives. And it's like mail-in ballots and early voting and all of that. So anyway, I'm happy to send you those items. I think that's probably at least around elections. helpful to share with folks. And then as far as like general disinformation campaigns, I think I'll have something that like you could send out to your members too.
I had one more question for David, and then definitely want to continue to hear from each of you. You started to speak to this, David, in terms of the interference of authoritarian governments in democracy, in elections, how divisive it's been, and specifically what was identified in the 2020 election, and how we went from 2016, where it's identifiable tactics, to more organic ones. Well, based on where we are now, we, the United States, and the authoritarian governments we've mentioned, do you think there will be an improvement in their tactics? What can you speak to in terms of how to recognize them, and the possible influence?
I think there will probably be less foreign involvement in trying to influence the 2022 midterms for a few reasons. One, it's a midterm and it's not a presidential race, as Rachael discussed earlier. Two, they've already achieved what they were going for, which is that we're doing the work for them, right? So they don't have to be waging widespread information operations against Americans, because the amount of disinformation and misinformation surrounding election integrity is being spread by Americans already. So there's not that same need for a Russian hand here. Mm-hmm. But what they could do, and Rachael outlined this at our event yesterday, is it's very possible, and they did this in 2016 as well, that they will try to penetrate voting systems, or at least give the impression that the Russian intelligence is penetrating voting systems, and then leak some sort of disinformation campaign that votes were manipulated. And because there's now such a lag between when votes come in on election day and when official results are ultimately tabulated, you have this great window for all sorts of mayhem to fly in the information sphere about, can we trust the votes? Was there, were votes manipulated? And so I'm worried that not only are there domestic voices already saying that's going to happen, that's I think the scariest thing, but you could have a government like Russia give the impression that it was attempting to manipulate votes, then falsely claim that this happened, and then all bets are off, right? And I'm not trying to scaremonger, and mostly I think these sorts of information threats are going to come from Americans themselves, but it's the type of operation that a government like Russia might wage against 2022. So those are sort of things to look out for,
And Russia did try to penetrate all voting systems in all 50 states in 2016. So that's not far-fetched.
It's not far-fetched.
Yeah.
Well, let's take this.
We're really
broaden it out.
so.
Bringing the sunshine on this gloomy day. No, it's important. And thank you again, all of you, for being here and for joining us, and for your initial question as well. What other questions are there? Let's get into a dialogue with each of you. Please.
Hi, there's our small community group called West Orleans. We were just at the commissioners meeting on July 14th. And there was a person there that got up and a comment asked if voting machines should continue in Westmoreland County. She'll also asked for hand counts and a few other things. We went from about 6 ballot boxes in the 2021 election to 1 ballot box in 2022. So I just wanted to ask, that's kind of some of what you're talking about, right? Those questions and those conversations, and the way to combat that as a community. We have a very terrible transportation system here in Westmoreland County, and getting people to vote is difficult enough. So when you take away people's access to those things and then frighten people about, mail-in ballots and.
Yeah, it really is a shame because. Again, use Rachel's words. Elections are ultimately run by humans, right? Or by humans. They're not perfect.
Right.
There are irregularities that happen in elections. That has happened in the United States and in other democracies since democracies were established many centuries ago. And that's not to dismiss the seriousness of irregularities in elections, but the system is designed, the election system in this country is in Westmoreland County is designed to catch those irregularities. So, in Pennsylvania, all 67 counties, all their voting systems have paper audit trails that sort of double counts and verify the electronic voting records of the voting machines. That is about as safe of a system as you're going to get. And, it's troubling that narrative is not out there, right? Instead, it's this narrative of, well, how can we trust the voting machines? Maybe they're manipulated online. And the same with mail-in ballots. I mean, mail-in balloting never really used to be controversial. It wasn't.
2021, or I'm sorry, 2020, we almost had finished counting with mail-in ballots here in the state of Pennsylvania. So it's very concerning.
Right. And it seems like it's like a new, what I mean by that is there has been mail-in ballot voting for years, right? And it hasn't been a contentious issue until recently. And so it's like the whole narrative around election procedure has been turned on its head. Something that everyone kind of trusted and bought into until maybe 2-3 years ago, now is something that many people are calling into question. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, when you're specifically asking about like, what do you do with this individual and how do you talk to them? I mean, I think that, yeah, I think there are people that are persuadable and people that are not persuadable. And I don't know what to tell you about the like kind of not persuadable category. But on the persuadable front, I think one kind of strategy is not throwing facts at them immediately, but like, why do you think that? Like, where did you get, not in a judgmental way, but like, where are you getting this information? How did you hear that? Oh, interesting. Well, here's what I have to share with you. And then the other piece is a lot of the breakdown is like being farther removed from the actual action. So I would actually encourage people to volunteer. And I know that's a great way to be up close and personal with like how this all works, how hard all of our election workers, poll workers, volunteers, and officials, are working on election day and then in the days after and the days before. And it's harder to spend 6 hours somewhere with people and actually see and help administer an election and still think that there is something sinister going on. So those would be my 2 big recommendations. I think we have to lift these people up, these election officials. I think that's a great point. I like, again, persuadable, non-persuadable, but I think it's worth a shot. I don't have an example where it's like this definitely worked, but there are, if you put an individual out there, you can trust an individual. You may not trust a system, but you're more likely to trust an individual. So I think that's absolutely worth a shot. And if we're going to be, as far as pointing people toward official sources, like they need to listen to their election officials. So yeah, I think that's a great idea.
I'll give you an example where it worked in my mind. In Georgia, where the Republican Secretary of State was pressured to no end to try to say that the election results in the state were fraudulent. And he himself, the Trump voter, would not do it. Not only did he prevent that from happening, he won re-election in the Republican primary. So I think that's an example of a particular political community buying into the the importance of having this sort of civil servants administer this really important function in their democratic life. So in my mind, that was buy-in for election procedure, election administration, and divorced from politics, even though it was a political primary. if he would have lost, I would have been maybe more pessimistic about it.
You know, the conversations are the same there still though, are there still people asking for a physical count?
I'm sure there are. I mean, of course, he didn't win with 100% of the vote. You know, there will always be people who, you know, if the system is rigged, as Rachel said. And look, we live in a democracy. People are entitled to those views, even if they're not based in facts. They're entitled to them. They're entitled to show up at the polls and vote their conscience. But I think the fact that an official like that in such a polarized environment, one re-election by his own party, was a good indication that state and local election officials are still trusted voices. And Rachel's right, like those voices need to be lifted up. It shouldn't take what happened in 2020 in that particular context to like make an example out of state and local election officials. Like, they've been doing this incredibly important function in our democratic life for decades, and they ought to be lifted up as voices, as trusted voices in our communities. And I think more people would buy into that if that were the case.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
So addressing, Pennsylvania didn't have abilities for adults until 2019. But before that, we absolutely had absentee mail-in ballots forever. And nobody questioned the authenticity or security of those absentee mail-in ballots. So I think the newness of the mail-in ballots was fertile ground for people to you know, charge that it was not secure. So to somebody like that, I would say, do you have then a problem with absentee mail-in ballots so that anybody who can't get to the polls would then have no way to vote? If you make that leap, you know, if those absentee mail-in ballots have been secure and you've trusted those for years, then there's absolutely no difference between that and no excuse for that.
That's a good point. Yeah, how will our servicemen and women vote if they can't vote absentee? We've always trusted that process to work well. That's a good example.
Thank you for that. Other, yes.
Because I mean, the thing is nobody likes to talk about this. It's uncomfortable for people, I get, but the misinformation that was used was, oh, we're allowing Latinos and non-white Hispanics to vote illegally because they don't have the papers, which is nonsense. But how do we control, like, so that was a big misinformation thing. How do we control, or how do we limit, I guess is the right way to say it, right? How do we limit that factor when it comes to the platforms? So, but how do we?
I wish I had an answer to that. They seem to be like Facebook had it in, I mean, not so you don't really know this type of thing, but they had signaled that they were shifting away from making elections a priority at all. So it kind of seems like that's where they really dug in 2020 and tried to do something. They're the metaverse now, and that's not a priority anymore. I don't know, technologically speaking, how you scan for something like that. I think Dave's idea of lifting up good content is a good one. I think there are some, you know, for a long time, I think I'm just beating up on Facebook, but there's a lot of material there. So yeah, but for like their algorithm rewarded the most kind of outlandish. And that's, you know, you would end up paying that was part of the deal. This is I'm unsatisfied by this answer, but it's a tough thing because then you get into regulating speech. And that's something we, for the most part, don't believe in this country. And so
I think there is an undercurrent of racism to some of these information campaigns because Rachel explained earlier, it's designed to trigger emotional response. And that emotional response adds gasoline to that fire.
Yeah, I particularly saw it on the Russian stuff.
Yeah, exactly.
They know us.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So that's our opinion knows on the current.
Yeah.
So,
And they were targeting minorities in the 2016 campaign, trying to mislead them as to how to vote. Send text messages, say, vote, just send your vote by text. They were targeting minority communities for that reason. So there are these racist dimensions to some of these campaigns, and I think I don't believe that regulating speech on social media platforms is the best way to go. I do think that when there's an obvious falsehood about elections that's being spread on social media, they have an obligation to take that down, because it's no, that's not freedom of speech. That is deliberately trying to undermine. Election day is not on Thursday, it's on Tuesday.
Yes,
I mean,
yes.
it's
COVID ones were really great.
So I know there was a lot of, and I used to live in Philadelphia area, that know there was they really targeted seniors as well. And they were sending text messages to seniors, oh, this polling place is closed now. And it was funny because a friend of mine called and he said, I'm gonna be a couple hours late. He said, I have to take my grandma to another polling station. And I said, that was a dude. They said, just go. Yeah. He called me back and said, how did you know that? I said,
Yeah.
So there's little things like that. And for the record, too, what I really know, this election coming up to do with, I'll even out the number of mail-in ballots that I have to actually vote. Because I was a long time member of the military. So that's how I vote.
Yeah.
And it's safe, it's secure, it's all this stuff, all the false stuff. It's just nonsense.
That touches on a point, you speaking of how it's safe and secure. Do we have trusted political people do ads about it being safe and secure? Or as yourself, a military person, years coming in, this is safe and secure. Go to your polls, know your count is being counted, and have it done.
Yes.
Yeah,
I am
I
a
know that.
huge advocate of that. I've long thought we needed to enlist, former military, celebrities. I don't think politicians are the uniting voices anymore, but there are other trusted voices in our community who could be the figurehead of public service.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people in business want to stay away from it.
Yeah, right.
It's one of those things. It's like, I don't want to touch that. Sure.
Well, but you did have some businesses step up and support in some manner of how the election was. And it's making go back to them again.
Yeah, I have this fantasy about that. Like, we check the dollars that come into the platform, and that's some way to figure out where like that's coming from. Because we do that with campaign finance. I think we do that.
So for political ads, I think that is now the case. It was not the case,
In
or
2016.
it should have been the case, but the enforcement was so bad. Yeah, exactly.
And I think it is better now. I mean, could someone get around it? Sure.
Yeah.
But we don't have as good of an intel into that's the frustrating part, into the ongoing covert pieces. So what we know is going on in the overt space. And one point on the, kind of inflaming racism piece from the Russian perspective, if you go on the state-backed media, which, targets, they have it for anywhere in the world, essentially. If there is any news event here in the United States where there's like Black Lives Matter protests comes to mind from, I guess that was 2020. But like they're going to broadcast everything on both extremes, on the two extreme sides. And like that's almost bread and butter. And Dave can speak this a little better, but it's been something that they've been kind of latching onto and exacerbating and taking advantage of since the 80s, or if not before, in American society. So, that is definitely part of the book. Yeah, exactly. Mhm. Mhm.
Some morning, my daughter go to work or something. Because I'm just so sad that the people walk down on the road, behind the park. And look at all that stuff down there. I was so sick of it, I couldn't even believe it. I was afraid. And I've been victim, families and my girl. Recent loss of all for months and long for the keep as old mama for and everything down to non that I'm hearing about sometimes. And I noticed that some people when I go to ride a car and the chemical parking lot will use or to get it go away. But sometimes it's cold in and I just pretend I have a visitor in a dining room with paper, no kitchen paper on it. Think I was going to cook anything. I didn't know what to say. This was really far away late at night. We built the place a few times. And I was scared there, picking up the light so long, they sit in the car for an hour, you need to get rid of them. Not the bad one, and the gas station go on there, and all of that. The house comes on. And the hour was on that cook. That's and that man that lived up there. I got him evicted and closed him out of the apartment and to move a family that to take quality away from me. So boys now I have money and all. Well, who's been good work in the park with some, we don't know, me that and till we close the place, I'm going to the door. I'm able to settle my family go back there and the service start for me job before. And I never seen I just been going for that bad, just like the thing all money out that bad. Just like that. And I just been going for that bad. But another thing. I was very sick.
So thank you for sharing that. A lot of different social issues have come up, from transportation to people experiencing homelessness. Before the talk started, we were talking about how the demographic is changing in Westmoreland County. There is a growing Latino community as well as other immigrant groups. How are we reaching folks and how to bridge that gap in the lead up now? I mean, we keep saying the lead up to the midterm elections, but it's now. It's here. It's around the
September's gonna
corner.
get here real fast.
Right. What other either questions do you have, or maybe something you were hoping to hear that we haven't gotten into yet? And then also I'm going to throw it back to the speakers to what questions they might have to learn more about the community and what you're going through and opportunities. Any other? Yeah. Was that a hand that you were?
No, I'm just thinking, I was hearing what you're talking about. Like regarding dark money and disclosure laws and recent Supreme Court rulings years. So do you think that there could be like a policy solution to at least try and illustrate where Facebook has tried to implement things like this, but I think you see any kind of process.
I mean, I think that the fact that it is so easy to establish show companies without having to disclose who the ultimate owner of that company is, has been a vehicle for money from countries like Russia and China to enter our political system for and we have made these recommendations. We've done a lot of engagement on Capitol Hill with members of Congress, and frankly, there's bipartisan receptivity to this. But changing those loopholes, financial regulatory system, and creating more transparency around shell companies would be a pretty easy way to reducing the amount of foreign money that legally now comes into the country and then perhaps illegally enters our campaigns and political climate without us knowing.
And we have this pretty brilliant malign finance fellow on our team who has been looking at like enablers of dark money. So different, like there are lawyers and sometimes PR professionals and different art dealers where there are a lot of this big foreign money is coming into the US. No questions are asked about it. Even like, I would assume you're suspicious, but you don't ask any questions. And so this would put into place questions that need to be answered before those transactions and that they can deal with that money. So that's been a big part of his work too. But his name's Josh Rudolph. So if you check out our website, you'll see it all. But yeah, he's definitely working on that in the weeds in a way that is a little over my head. Yeah.
So is there any momentum in Congress to not by campaigns? I'm going to say it's used by PACs that advocate for a campaign.
I'm gonna say no.
Yeah.
I was nodding my head because I was like, there is, bipartisan support of something about like, regulating the enablers of dark foreign money.
Yeah.
But then you were like, in politics, no.
It's just like domestic, political. It's probably not. There's probably no consensus.
And even you see like, there's a lot of complaints about how like Republican PACs, use money from the Democratic side until they catch up and figure out how to use money in the same way. And so we saw that in 2022. And yeah, so if it's working for you, it's not probably gonna be your top priority.
So go ahead.
Sorry, is there political will to really create legislation to protect us from this? Because I see it like you do, it's undermining the fact, right? So what is the political will to stop that from happening?
On the money front in particular,
Well,
or
just
on,
general.
just general.
Or is our elected representatives saying, this is a problem, we need to do something about it?
So depends how you frame the issue. If you
It's like
talk,
everything else.
no,
Right,
it's true.
it really
I know
is,
it sounds
right?
like- tell me something I don't know. But like, for example, if you go onto the Capitol and you talk about the government of China interfering in American democracy, everyone will overlook you. And everyone will want to hear what solutions you have to recommend to build into legislation that they would draft. If you go to Capitol Hill and you talk about the government of Russia, until
A little, Ukraine changed
I
things.
was
a
just
little bit.
saying, until recently,
Yeah.
but up until the recent invasion of Ukraine, if you went to Capitol Hill and talk about Russia, most members of Congress would open their door to you, regardless of their party affiliation. And most would agree with your opinion that the Russian government is really trying to interfere in American democracy, and that that's bad for American democracy. Not every member of Congress would want to do something about it because it was too politically toxic of an issue at that moment in time. And 2016 to 2021 or two even, it was politically toxic to talk about Russian interference in democracy. It shouldn't have been, but it was. And it was frustrating for us. We were officially a bipartisan organization when we launched. And the whole point was to try to get Republicans and Democrats to agree on a way forward to counter this activity, to create better resilience in our institutions, to push back against it. And most Republicans and Democrats agreed that we had to do something about it, but we just couldn't move legislation forward. And maybe that will change now on the Russia front because of the war in Ukraine, but I also think we're so consumed domestically by what's happening here that I think most people see the Russia problem or even the China problem, the whole foreign interference problem as yesterday's threat. And they're not altogether wrong. I mean, most of the problems that are happening now are domestically driven, right? They're not necessarily driven by Russia or China, but Russia and China are still incredibly active in trying to exacerbate these divisions. And there could very well be a moment in time where there's more unity domestically, and those countries are trying to get us in each other's throats. So there's never a bad opportunity for Washington to actually try to enact policies and legislation that push back against it. But there still isn't that like overarching political.
Feel that it's now less empowering than it was January 6th. Like, it doesn't feel as if that is lessened. Because I hear you saying that, like, now it's more domestic, but I think it's domestic because that was seen in
Yes.
2020, and so it blew up on January 6th.
Yes.
I mean, right, but like, do you feel that that is lessened in the last year? I don't feel.
I don't.
We knocked doors to get out the votes, and we knocked over 800 doors, and 25% of people said to me, I don't know if I can vote because I don't know if my vote isn't being looked at by Russia, or it's not real, our elections aren't real anymore. I feel something, and that's right here in Greensburg.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do not think the threat has diminished, certainly on either side. I mean, I think.
I just think it makes the Russia and China things more dangerous because that's lighter, that's
Yeah, I think it speaks to the success of the Russian operation in 2016 that you are having that conversation with voters in your community. Like I think that there's a direct line between that conversation and the 2-year campaign that they waged against us in 2014 to 16.
and now we have politicians.
Exactly. So they're speaking the talking points for them. Yeah.
So that's one, the normalization of accusing, lobbing accusations of widespread fraud when you lose an election that took place in 2020 is what scares me the most. So that sets that like kind of up until that point, like it really was a red line. You conceded after you lost and you tried to be not that I'm biased or anything, but John McCain's concession speech in 2008 is like one of the days I was most proud to work for him. And he was like, our country needs to unite now. Trump blew that out of the water in 2020 and went so far the other direction. But what really concerns me is that for some segment, and I'm not saying everyone, I still think that it's very much candidate specific, but like that's an option, that's a tactic, that's part of a playbook that could be employed. And that really scares me.
Yeah, we have someone here that's at the university. Is very proud of that situation.
Yeah.
That's why we're here.
Yeah.
That's the main concern. Not just for our county.
Well, in the spirit also of having Rachael and David also learn more about what's happening in Westmoreland County. And I mean, we're having this conversation
Totally, yeah.
intentionally. We want to be not just in the city, hearing what's happening in Greensburg and the county more broadly, southwestern PA, in this moment in time, because midterms are so important and get so overlooked. So, and in the lead up for the years ahead, what questions do you all have from the folks in the room? Do you have anything that you'd like to know that?
No, I mean, it's so like this back and forth is really valuable because we look at these as like very like kind of the macro trends and the tools and tactics, but these are global problems that play out locally. And so I like this to us is so, thank you, so valuable. Because we need to hear about, 20, like I wrote that down, 25% of 800 doors knocked and there was doubt about their votes. That is so valuable to understand how it's playing out on the ground, and really informative to us. And when we're making recommendations to lawmakers or whomever else, that informs our recommendations in such a real way. So just any other experiences, either, in how disinformation, the big lie, anything around elections has impacted you personally or that you've encountered, we'd love to hear more about. If anyone has anything like that.
To your 25%. Is there any indication at all of which party?
We try to be nonpartisan when we're moving out, just because we want sort of
I understand that.
engagement, but I would say more independent Democrat, is what we were working on. Independent, this seems to be the, I'm working more for Pennsylvania United, there's engagement in the summer. One of the areas we really focus on is farm. I believe the last is that I looked at is 15% of that population is our church.
Oh, wow, that's
Yeah.
very low.
March, there to not worse for about 3 weeks. Every single, they said, almost to a person, every single person that they were able to register in a state we cannot go and try.
Right.
That's interesting.
This engagement and because they just don't trust the parties anymore. And so that I can ask for this too.
Yeah.
So I want to.
That's interesting.
It's terrifying for a group that, we really want to see local people elect these positions, but when we don't have the maximum of people want to vote, and when we register to vote all the time, that is a real, struggle. We have people there that live in that community their whole lives, want to run for city council next year, and it's terrified that they will forget it because the people that really need that engagement to feel that there is a hope in that community.
Well, and that's so interesting because I think that there's a crisis in the national parties as well. That's more of a slow burn. So, it's not on fire yet.
You saw here, if you were closer to Irving for Summer League versus the Irving, and there was definitely that old time Republican versus the more squad kind of feel.
Mhm.
We talked to a lot of others about from 2000 text messages now. Very polarizing. She made she was sort of everything, and then she's going to take on the whole part. She's the worst thing that ever happened.
Do you think there are voices in the county that can transcend some of those divided? Is there a person out there that could instill greater confidence in elections, regardless of its outcome? Or is that just as hard on the micro level as it is on the macro national level these days?
I think it is. I used to work with government, but the behavioral health side, on the other side of the state, and it was fun. The commissioners would ask me to say stuff. And yeah, people like to go and say stuff, and then they would kind of hide behind the parties. Something new legislation is good. That it all.
And that's exactly what we were about.
They're so frank. I mean, first off, I don't think it should be a full-time job. They show up at one meeting a week and they vote. Right? It's really, I don't think our legislature should be full-time position either. I know, I'm going to tell you this. I know a Republican senator in our state who's never had a job. He took his father's seat when his, he was in high school, probably know who he is. And then when a great guy, halfway Jim Rhodes, who was a Republican, but did great work for the state of Pennsylvania, particularly in education and drug and alcohol. When he that's the way to focus. See, he's never had a job. And he's working for us to try to create legislation that makes sense for business. Never had a job, it doesn't make sense. So for me, it's like, if we need to change, that's why I used to get your brother like marching on for everything, right? And so like, Jim, this is the right stuff, we should be talking about this. And saying, right. And he used to say the whole time, he used to call everybody babe. You know, it's a babe, it doesn't matter if you're a B and an R, we just get you right. Right? And like, and it's just, that's just not existing. Right? That's what we have to get back to. There's good people on both sides.
That's right, and we have first conversation in our group, which is about environmental work here around the York River, familiar with that, barrier teams. And the commissioner needs to help her get, and would help her write those and stuff to state, right? And commissioners, they are so separated from us. At 10 o'clock in the morning, on a Thursday, nobody can come to those. Maybe they don't do anything. Work. We do their lunch courthouse, which is not some people are comparable. They very distinguished from us. It's hard because we definitely focus here. One of them was going to the church saying that the cost for ballot boxes is not. That's not for disabled people, that's anybody who has a health condition. People who just don't have transportation. And then, for the first 4 weeks of the first week, the ballot boxes open in the courthouse with parking. So that's that. It wasn't so one of us put together in the paper that they moved into the parking straight to drop the ballot off. So you will pay to drop the ballot off.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm like comforted that it's not just us or, yeah, it's that.
In our elections official, the election charter wasn't on the courthouse, it's now has 2 jobs. They geotag another.
Was that, did they talk about those cost savings or?
They did not say why.
I think it's some of
So
those.
that makes for 2 hours. So it's not real sure about that. I just know if you have gotten a paper ballot, if you've gotten a ballot, sometimes they'll post election, and if you're lucky, they're close.
Yeah.
Issues. Postal service, but yeah,
Sure,
either, it's really hard for large people.
So I kind of want to say that there were some things that were different. Narrative on the elections. More clearly to kind of get. We have some people that want to comment on the narrative that so what are some kind of actions that we would recommend on the local and state level for residents to take to address some of these concerns, and also to kind of try and push forward some of that with policy options?
Yeah, I would say, so I like the idea of lifting up election officials and official sources on elections. I think that makes a lot of sense, kind of pointing people there. The other thing that like flew out of my mind at this moment, so promoting election official sources. And then, so our kind of theory of it is that equipping people with understanding like how like the disinformation campaigns run on emotional responses, and kind of educating of like how that works is helpful, and at least when you're consuming information to do so in a more present way, in a more thoughtful, purposeful way. So I would say having conversations around like the information diet and exactly like how you're consuming information is helpful. I think we've all found in different ways, shape, or forms that just like trying to convince people with like the sheer volume of your facts doesn't work. And so I think there needs to be a softer touch and maybe like a more indirect touch. And I think that can start with like a shared vocabulary around the information space. So I think that's really important too.
I mean, I think trying to make the issue relatable to people on individual level is important as well. We did some of this in the run to the 2018 midterm where we worked with organizations like the League of Women's Voters or the National Urban League, trying to help specific communities understand how disinformation campaigns are tailored to them specifically. So that's a useful tactic too, is just trying to put into context that here's how this information actually affects you and, in your life.
That's a great point. And I was just going to offer an example. So in 2020, their kind of Iran's big move, right? They tried several different things, but they sent out fake emails from what looked like the Proud Boys. And you'll probably remember this. There's some were targeted at Pennsylvanians. And it was both to threaten and to discourage voting. And it was so sloppy, like it's always kind of hard to understand, like, was the intent here to actually scare people, or was it to, inflame everyone that the Proud Boys were doing this and then backlash and conversation? I don't really know. But like, that's a great example because it's so concrete. Like, it's like an email was sent from a group that everyone knows that there was plenty of controversy around, or seemingly from a group. And that was actually a totally different actor giving false information and making threats. And so we had the 2016 examples are great just because, as I said, the Mueller report is just so detailed. But in the Black community, there was an online, they created several fake personas. The one that stands out to me is, it was like woke Louisa, and it was a Russian operative, right? And so they use this account to like really start interacting with leaders within that movement and within that community, and build up a trust. And then you could see how it was like further and further to the extreme that she again, this persona was leading the online conversation. So like specific examples like that, where I still think it's mind blowing that like Russians organized competing protests over like in the United States, and people showed up. Like, it's stuff that deserves to be told again, because it just goes to show you that like you have to be, it's not that you shouldn't trust people, but like you can't trust everything online. And that feels so basic, but I think those examples are powerful.
Is there any chance that there could be a bipartisan education campaign on how the voting system actually works? Because I don't think most people understand what happens at the time, you register to vote till the vote gets into the system, to the paper counting back up the whole system, to have local people explaining the process and the security system that goes through the whole checks. And as far as even mail-in ballots, the true process that's followed. I go back to as a kid, we all watched Schoolhouse Rock, and the real type of thing, something that simple of how the process works, that you get a better feeling of how it really would be hard to mess with this.
So I'll just say the kicker here, like I love that idea. The kicker is it's different in all 50 states, and they're even different.
Making it local, or
yeah, I mean,
basically,
yeah,
each state that, because our system's at least statewide.
yes, yeah. No, I think that's a great idea.
So the really cool thing that happened in 2021, a lot of people see that we were running local campaigns here, so it's going to have elections on a lot, especially in the election. And when I went in, there was a dropping off of ballots. So because of this issues, you would go in and collect paper ballots ahead of time, right? You can go in there and they have those like little cardboard things that you get, you know, in high school, but the science fair projects, and you can fill out that, they will print your ballot there, or mail-in ballot, and then you fill it out there in the office, and you have to take it back and put it in the boxes that would, because we don't do we don't count any mail-in ballots here, so all the elections.
Yes.
Stuff, but you can actually see them, buy them and so forth. There was definitely a group of people that were done, but were just very fascinated by the process. So there is an interest in the community to watch how some of that happens. They were like, oh, you put it in that room is lost. There's definitely like, oh, that's really interesting to watch. You print them, they have the person's name already at the top, like it's not like you can fill in Joe Smith.
Right.
And then like I fill it out and the guy checked it to make sure everything was done. He put it in the envelopes and then put it in this box.
And unless you've actually watched that process happen, you don't realize the number of different steps, and it's a bipartisan effort
Yes.
throughout the entire
Yes.
process
Mhm.
of how it goes through. And I just think the average person really does not truly understand exactly what happens. to the
Well,
time.
I think what you're saying before is genius, which is where you tell people who have real concerns about this, that they should volunteer. There are these positions that are always available, they would never work on election day.
But that's not always a feasible option for everybody.
It's not,
Sure.
but I mean, but it would be a way to spark an interest in some people, and re-engage them in a way that then they, like she said, spend 6 hours, which I think your Westmoreland County is possibly is much 12 hour day. You can't leave once you're in, and you have to stay there the entire time. We have a couple of election workers, I suppose. But it would be very interesting to see them go in, spend that day together, and then the difference of opinion, or at least thought process on where they can.
And to me, it's like that big great pitch, like the change of the League of Women Voters. You can put together a short video
Yeah.
on that they can splash on Facebook and everywhere.
You were gonna add
This works in our
something.
county.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I
No,
don't know
it's-
if they have a video, but the League of, I'm with the League of Women Voters.
So I mentioned that.
But the League of Women Voters Pittsburgh has a document that details the life of the ballot. And if you're interested, I'm sure that you can get in touch with them and they'd be happy to let you use it.
We need to make it now fun, that people can watch it. I love seeing that.
There you go. There you go.
Yeah,
It is really true. It makes it.
yeah. You have to reach.
Very good point. If local officials that we don't trust are the ones explaining, the ones that have their phone numbers out there, so they're available, there's a higher level of credibility than somebody somewhere.
Yeah.
That's number one. Number two, I have a question. We don't seem to have an active league, that's one thing. But it seemed that the dialogue was pretty good when the voters had. Not about the House, but it was a question of candidates with you know, non-biased question.
Mhm.
Now, you know, we're missing that. And that allows people to get discouraged and drop out. Now, that's exactly what our enemies, foreign domestic, want us to do. So we're falling in that hands. Now, it seems to me, since English had proved that you can dice and slice a population and persuade them with fear, in this case, the Brexit. Nobody believed that Brexit. But they were able to dice and slice and sell fear. Now, I don't see any news media talking about the ramification, what it's done to the European Union, but mostly Great Britain, in terms of reduced trade, in terms of lost companies. You know, we're doing a very good job of educating where already happening. Now, the guys that know how to do this now are there. They're not literally there, they're around. The especially within Facebook. And especially outside of Facebook, that know how to manipulate Facebook to their own advantage. Now, until we do something about showing how silly it is for one issue voters to get twisted up in their shorts about gun control, abortion, whatever the hot button of the day is, they're missing the big deal. It's like the old carnival game that came to all of our counties, the Shelby. And you know, what we're paying attention to this, it's going over here. So the real issues weren't being discussed by either party. Now, the taxpayers and voters are not holding them accountable. Until we have a breakaway candidate that can call both parties on their stuff. Let's face it, you know, everybody's that's empowering one of those two parties has padded their own wall, their own beneficial interests. And I don't mean literally the wall, but I mean for the unions, they get what they want for their and they're doing a good job representing. But the fact is, the wind guys increased parking. In Washington County, we built beautiful new highway to go there when we're several miles away from a highway that already is. But at the same time, nobody's talking about this. You know, gasoline prices could be high. They're only being able to afford it. But we're not able to talk about policy issues. I think that's twisted up our shorts over extra. I don't want to say face, because they are real issues. But as long as you are allowing yourself to get manipulated and say, I'm a one issue person, I'm going to go with X, Y, Z, and that's what it's doing, then we deserve what we're getting. Well, I don't know how to resolve that unless we have a good group, like the dialogue that occurs a year or so before the election of educators. That's one. Number two, breakaway candidates from both parties that say, hey, look, this system has not worked for you, little bit. You know, during this COVID month, this is a huge scale. It's going to break when we see who really got the money. And the little guy's going to be even more disenfranchised.
Thank you. Oh, sorry. I was gonna transition there. We have just a few minutes left, but no, I appreciate what you're saying and bringing your voice into the conversation. And I see you're wearing a Rotary shirt, so you have a network, hopefully, that you're connected to. Rotary does important work as well. And I think we've heard from a few different organizations that are in this room. Amazing that the League of Women Voters is now here. You said just founded in Westmoreland a year ago? A year
Oh, wow.
ago, Voices of Westmoreland County. So thank you for the different perspectives that you've each brought in. We have a few minutes left, so I want to turn it back to David and to Rachel to close us out with maybe a little bit of hope. I know we started very heavy and the heaviness continues because that's the reality of this challenging conversation. But I know for me, two words that I kept hearing as you were both speaking and as everyone came into the conversation in different ways is integrity. When you talked about Jim Rhodes, when you talked about John McCain, when we've talked about different leaders, the process, there are hopeful moments, there is integrity, there are people with integrity, and proximity, whether it's proximity through volunteering or proximity to our neighbors, because it's harder to hate the person that you know. So these two words and proximity to the news and the facts as well, so that you have the information that you need. David, do you want to share a little bit, close us out on some hope?
I mean, well, this is going to sound cliche, but I mean it sincerely. I imagine we are people sitting around this table are from all walks of life with different political views. You know, Rachel's from Arkansas. I grew up in Eastern Pennsylvania. Here we are in a town in Western Pennsylvania. You know, different backgrounds, but we're having a conversation where we all sort of loosely agree that there's a crisis right now in American politics, American democracy, but it's not insolvable. Like there are solutions here, right? And I guess I felt like, for me, looking back at what happened in 2020 election, the system bent, but it didn't break, right? And that alone gave me like a little bit of optimism. And here we are, a year and a half, 2 years later, having a conversation about how to make things better. And I'm sure if you asked us any number of issues, we would not all agree right on that, but we could have that conversation. And we need to have more of those like micro, local, targeted conversations to get that sort of consensus across the aisle, across the community, that we ought to trust our system. We ought to trust elections. They should work. They have worked. And sometimes your guy or gal is going to win, and sometimes they're not. And that's American democracy. That's the beauty of the system. And I think that alone gives me like a little bit of optimism going into yet another contentious election cycle.
Thank you, Rachel.
And McCain used to say, in the words of Chairman Mao, it's always darkest before it's totally black. I like really, it means a lot to me to be telling the old man's jokes, but it just seems very appropriate here. But no, so but I do agree. I think that kind of the recovery here, I also it's not lost on me that like all of this came after like pandemic lockdown and kind of like the fraying of our social connections, those loose social connections, which are so critical to trusting your government and your community. And so I really believe that like the way out of this starts here, and starts with organizations like y'all's, and where you're rebuilding those local connections in a meaningful way, and like having people reinvest in the community. That is where I think it absolutely has to start. The other piece of hope is that the people in the middle, that are not screaming on either side, can't tune it out. And there are times when I want to tune it out, but you have to stay engaged. And I think that when, we saw some type of gun legislation move on a bipartisan basis through Congress and signed into law for the first time in like 30 years, like that is not because of a gun lobby outcry or it was because normal people were like, I am so tired of this. And that's incredible. Like I worked on Hill for a long time, and I can't remember the last time I saw something that seemed so impossible happen. And so that to me was really inspiring, that like if you actually engage, if you reach out to your elected officials, like they want to stay in office. So like we do have power there. So those are my two bits of hope. And really like these conversations are really great. So I appreciate all of you coming tonight and sharing and being here. And
Yeah.
Thanks.
Here, here. Thank you all for being here. Thank you to our speakers, David, Rachel, the Alliance for Securing Democracy. If you can join me in applause, thank you. And thanks to all who joined us online, and we will be hanging around. If you have any other questions, want to get in a little bit more of a conversation, just wanted to wrap us on time. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.